again. Thank y'all for being here at the Noon Debrief. Just to say something you probably already know, this program is presented by the South Carolina Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum, but we've lost our room over there that we have live programs in for a time. And the Richland Library has just been wonderful about providing this facility, which is way better than the one we have over at the museum for programs like this. And I was just telling Amy that we'll probably do this occasionally, even after we get that room back, because these have been good. Up to now, with these off-site programs, we have stuck to staff or former staff speakers, just to be safe, because we knew what we were getting, and they did this all the time. It's usually been Joe Long, the curator of education, but one was done by Fritz Hamer over here, talking about the Battle of Ya Drang in 1965, those have gone great. This is the first time we're returning to our normal pattern of guest speakers, people who've been there and done that, or at least studied it. We have veterans and historians and folks like that. And Moss Blachman spoke to us last year over at the museum, so I know he gives a good talk. But I've known that for a while, because I've known Moss for, 30 years or something like that. I remember I used to hear old people talk about knowing somebody 40 years ago, and to me that's like nothing, That's the mid-'80s. But anyway, Moss, I didn't put this in my opening remarks here, but Moss has been all sorts of things aside from an intelligence officer in Vietnam, and I wouldn't have known that he had served if he didn't wear a little lapel pin of a Bronze Star on his jacket pretty regularly. And so finally I asked him about it, and that led to asking him to do this. But I'm not even going to try to summarize his career, because he's done so many things. The first time I met Moss, I went over to see him, and hey, Alan, this is Alan Robertson, the executive director of the museum. I first went to visit him in his office over in Gambrell Hall at USC, and I walked in, and behind him, behind his desk, is a map of the Western Hemisphere, but it's upside down. By our perspective, that means there's no reason maps have to be north at the top, but this was south at the top. So you had South America at the top, with the Tierra del Fuego pointing up at the ceiling, and Canada at the bottom. And I looked at that, and I really loved it, because when I was a kid, my dad was in the Navy. I moved all over the place. I lived in Ecuador for 2.5 years, and I've always felt like we ignore South America too much, and so I liked seeing that. And you were teaching Latin American political science or history at that time. He's done lots of other things. I know that you will enjoy his talk. After he speaks, as we did last time, we just started this program, I have some tickets for a free tour of the museum, lasts about half an hour, right after this program, if you're free to do that. Just see me afterwards. I got a bunch of these. Anyway, join me in welcoming Moss Blachman.
I don't think I need it. You can hear me, can't you?
Yep.
Anybody who can't hear me? If you can't hear me, you shouldn't be able to answer that, but
You don't mumble like me.
no. What I'm going to do is share a series of vignettes, kind of stories about the experience, because what Brad had asked me to do was not give this sort of analytical academic talk about Vietnam, but really to talk about what was it like for me as a young person, newly in the Air Force, to be able to go to Vietnam. What did I experience, what it was like? So I just want to give you a little bit of background on it, and then kind of share a series of stories of things that happened to me in Vietnam and in relation to Vietnam. I don't mind being interrupted at any time. I'm very comfortable with that. If you have a question or if you have something you feel a need to say at that point, you want to have something explained, that's fine, okay? So whatever that may be. I grew up as a Southern boy, not here in South Carolina. I grew up in Portsmouth, Virginia. How many of you know where Portsmouth, Virginia is? Oh, wow. I'm amazed. That's like saying I grew up in Casey. Nobody in the world knows where it is. Everybody knows Norfolk, but not many people know Portsmouth. So I grew up in Portsmouth, Virginia. It was Navy land. I had never been out of the South till I went to college. I went to Brandeis University outside of Boston, which was an extraordinary experience. I've lived in a lot of places, Rio, Saigon, Mexico City, a bunch of other places, but I never had a culture shock like I had when I went to Boston and met all these New York and Massachusetts folks. I didn't realize they were human for a while, given their cultural differences and the way in which they did things and what seemed very bizarre to this Southern boy. I had, as a result of that, a kind of romantic image about being in the military. I sort of knew it was not too wonderful because I had relatives who had been in the Second World War, and I knew that was not pretty. I knew about that. I'm old enough that I actually remember when Franklin Roosevelt died, and I remember my neighbors and my parents crying and being upset. I don't remember a lot more about it, but I remember that. And my father was not in the draft. He just was over the age. But our home was one of these places that was set up to handle the neighborhood. We had a great big garage in the back, and we had this vehicle, quasi-fire vehicle, fire suppression vehicle, no engine. And about every month or 6 weeks, a group of men would come over the house at night. We'd open up the door, and they would take this out and kind of move around the neighborhood to practice what to do. And I remember that extremely well, how all that worked. So I had, I come of an era that understands something about the Second World War and looked at war, patriotism, all those things quite differently than folks do coming up today. And of course, a lot of memories in the post-World War II period. So on the one hand, service seemed like something that was attractive, and on the other hand, I didn't really, it's another level, want to go in. When I went to college, I finished. I had thought I was going to go to law school. I decided while I was in college that wasn't really what I wanted, and I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted. And in the meantime, we were sending troops all over the U.S., all over the world, rather. A lot of things happening, and the draft was really heating up. And I figured, okay, if I'm going to go in, I'm going to go in with what I know, the Navy, because that's big Navy, Norfolk, Portsmouth. And through a series of things, what the Navy showed me is they couldn't get it straight to send me the information on what to do and how to do it, and I thought, I'm not going to do the Navy. And through a series of other things, I ended up going to the Air Force, where I was told that since I was a college graduate, I could be in something called Officer Training School, which was different from Officer Candidate School. Officer Candidate School is 24 weeks long. And half of it, presumably, is to break you down from being an enlisted man and then build you up to be an officer. And they said, Air Force's view was if you already had your college degree, you didn't, quote, need to be broken down as an enlisted man. Very strange. And you could just be built up as an officer. So I ended up in San Antonio, Texas in April of 1962. And I became an officer. I was kind of enjoying in some ways. Any of you have been in, they're really interesting things. I won't go into this in detail. But one of the things that really caught me from the very beginning was literally those first couple of days when I got there in the Air Force, at Medina Air Force Base. It was extraordinary because just like we look a lot different in this room right now, it didn't matter how much hair you had on your head or your face. It didn't matter how well dressed you were or you weren't. Somewhere in the middle of that first day, at the end of that day, when we were standing in a room, about 150 young men, we all looked alike because we were all stark naked standing in two lines. We were stark naked and our heads were shaved. The distinctions of race, class, all those things, money, all of those kinds of things that we think about were gone. I mention that because one of my observations that I just want to share, so I think one of the greatest mistakes we made in this country was getting rid of national service. I don't care if it's physical military service, but there is something about people coming together and learning how to work together as human beings and appreciating differences in humans and how you work as teams and so on. And that was a very important lesson also for me in Vietnam. And part of what I found that was sort of never exactly said to me, but was an expectation because I was responsible for a team of people, was learning how to build a team that worked together. You don't build additive teams. They're not billiard balls. You don't say, you go do this, you go do this, you go do this, and I hope it'll all fit. It's an integrated team. And you have to work together. And if one person screws up, everybody is screwed up. And that was a very early lesson. So I was, I kind of was interested. I got in the Air Force. I had been told, here's what, you can even be an intelligence officer if that's what you would like to do. Actually, I wanted to fly, but unfortunately, these things didn't work out too well for that. So they offered me the opportunity to be a navigator. And I said, if I can't fly, I don't want to be a navigator. And then they said, oh, how about being an intelligence officer? And he said, tell you what, you go in. Right now what we'll do is you'll go through a 12-week course at Lowry Air Force Base in Denver. And then we'll send you to Rhine-Main, Wiesbaden, or to Yokota Air Force Base in Japan. And I thought, boy, this is pretty nice. I was newly married. Gosh, this sounded like pretty good. Always it sounds pretty good. How many of you here were in the service? Well, as you know, you get to pick anything you want and do anything you want, right? Just wait and it changes. About 2 weeks before I graduated or became an officer, they came down and all of us in my class, in my officer training class, who were in the intelligence field were told, we just figured out we don't need general intelligence officers anymore. We need our officers to be trained as photo interpreters, or what later became known as image interpreters. That is, folks who could look at various kinds of imagery to understand what's going on. And by the way, that is not in Denver, Colorado. That's in Wichita Falls, Texas. And no, it's not 12 weeks, it's 31 weeks. So, and you have a choice. You can do it, or you can do it. That's your choice. So I ended up in Wichita Falls, Texas, and I got my choice of places, and among them, I happened to choose Shaw Air Force Base. All those wonderful places in Europe and Japan, gone. Those assignments were no longer around. So I came here, and my initial work, this was right around, this is 1963 now, early 63. So it's right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as I was telling someone earlier, I literally spent an enormous amount of time looking at every single inch of Cuban territory, looking for the missiles to make sure they went out. I and others that I worked with, and we weren't the only ones, were measuring the ships the Soviets had to determine if the missiles were really on them, because these are things you could do with imagery. Now, as you were saying, in today's world, artificial intelligence is going to be doing a lot of this. But we had to do it ourselves. And that was a fascinating experience. So I had lots of good opportunity, did a lot of other things, and then Vietnam hit. And I don't know how many of you are old enough or remember this, but the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, went on television in 1965 in March, and he made a statement to the effect that the United States was considering we would have to send troops, that we weren't sure about what was going on, a whole bunch of things like that. Just so you know, in January of 1965, that is 2 months before he made the speech, I received orders to report to Vietnam. I received orders to report to Vietnam at the end of September. Those orders came down from Tactical Air Command at Langley Air Force Base, and they had come to the Langley from the Pentagon. And those orders had been developed by a panel in the Pentagon that put together whom they had selected from around the military to go to Vietnam. This panel met in November '64. So when Johnson went on television in March '65 and acted or talked as if, you know, we're sitting here contemplating it, what I didn't know at the time, I know now, is that in fact all these things were in prep, these things were underway, and that's what it was. And oh, by the way, that meant I was being extended beyond my commitment in the Air Force. Just another point in terms of this, I was reading a statistic today, kind of getting ready for this, and it was talking about the number of volunteers in Vietnam. You're looking at one. I was a volunteer. How do I know I was a volunteer? Because I was told I was a volunteer. I got orders, and I was told you will report. The term we used in those days, I don't know what they use now, is voluntold. And that's kind of where we were. I say this because there's so much mythology around the Vietnam War, and lots of understanding and misunderstandings about what was really going on. And to understand this context, so at this point in my life, I had made the decision, I think I really do want to be an academic. I want to study Latin America. I want to deal with US foreign policy. And now all of a sudden I'm told, no, you're going to go in the military. So I end up in the Air Force, and then from that, I've got this 4-year commitment. Okay, I'm going to do my 4 years, which is really a little over 4 years because it didn't include the time till when I was commissioned. And then all of a sudden, I get orders in January of '65 to report at the end of September. And I thought this was really strange, and I wanted to go to school starting in the fall. So I went through the channels of the Air Force and asked, and I said, "That's sweet." And I said, how about this? I don't want to go because I want to get out, but if I'm going to have to go, let me go early. I will volunteer to go in June or July so I can get back. No, we don't need you until we need you, and therefore we're not going to do that, and whatever happens, happens. So this is background. Oh, and by the way, you need to know how to deal with infrared photography and some other specialized things. So we need you to go to Denver for a couple of weeks, which is not the worst thing in the world, for special school. But I was going to be away from my family for that. And then we're going to take you over there. And as I've pointed out, and those of you who served can understand, when I got to Vietnam and I said, well, you know, I had this specialized training in Denver, you know, where's the equipment, what are we doing? And they looked at me like I was an alien from Mars. They didn't have any idea what it was about. Well, so here I am, this person who's involved. I was doing a reasonably good job in the Air Force, supposedly being selected for this assignment was an indication of that. And I'm ready to go. And I had, as I said, a kind of romantic idea about the military. Well, let me just say that that lasted until about the point where we got in Vietnamese airspace. I won't go through all the details before we got there, but when we got in the airspace and we were about to land in Saigon, it was not your Eastern Airlines or whatever come in. It was like this. And when we got out, we had an initial briefing. And in the initial briefing, they told us about all the things we had to watch out for. They told us things like, you have to be very careful anywhere if you get a glass of water or something to drink, because what looks like ice might be shaved glass. And you have to be careful because, as they told us, true or not, the Viet Cong were looking to get American soldiers that they could interrogate. And if you were Air Force, you were more prime than if you were Army. If you were an officer, you were more prime than if you were an enlisted man. And oh, by the way, any of you happen to be in intelligence, you're really at the top of the list. So I had been en route for about 2.5 days. The initial plane I was supposed to take out of Travis Air Force Base was canceled, and we just sat there until we finally got on the plane we had to be on. So everybody on the plane was completely exhausted as we're getting this briefing. They had housing for all the enlisted men, but they turned to those of us who were officers and said, we unfortunately don't have any room in the bachelor officer quarters anymore. So we have a place we're going to put you up for a few nights, and then you have to find a place on the economy that you can stay until we can find more BOQ, which they never found the whole time I was there. So they scare the hell out of you in terms of having any contact with anybody, and then say, oh, by the way, go off in the economy and find a place to live. And as we're about to get in a truck to go to the BOQ, they said, oh, by the way, be careful, because last week a Vietnamese on a motorcycle rode up right next to us and tossed a grenade in the back of the truck where they were doing things. So we need you to be vigilant. The romanticism about war began to wear thin. And we were all scared, but we did it. We went and did all these things. And of course, over a period of time, you get inured to these things. You just, your mindset changes, you do a whole lot of things. But the real romanticism for me really shifted at one really critical point. In November of that year, there was something called Battle at Ia Drang Valley. How many of you know about Ia Drang? Okay. The first cab, it was in November, and after that battle, the body bags, the bodies that were brought in, were brought to Tan Son Nhut, the air base where I was. Those of you who've been in Vietnam know what it means to be in a hot place. They did not have the refrigerated mortuary ability. This seems like such a simple little point, but they didn't have it. They only were able to handle a body or two, a few bodies a week, because that's what the casualties had been up until that point. And here we have this mass number. And in a matter of a day or two, there was a stench around the base. which was of the dead. It is difficult to tell you what that's like when you're in the middle of it. I wasn't in the battle itself physically, but I'll never forget that feeling and that sense. And a lot of the romanticism went out. Vietnam, I don't think was romantic for anybody. I don't know, maybe somebody here had a romantic experience, but nobody that I worked with or was involved with had a particularly romantic experience. And I learned about war in a way that no American movie tells you. There is nothing that you see in those movies that give you the sense of what it is. Movies have their highlights about what they do, but they don't generally give you any sense of what it's really like to be engaged, what it's like when mortars are going off. And I can tell you how you get used to it. Here's something that's kind of interesting. So I'm exchanging tapes with my wife at that time. I have a 1.5 old daughter. And of course she's concerned about how I am. And we were writing letters, and I'm sending home and saying, you know, I'm fine, etc. So one night I was making a tape. And those old, remember the old things? They were the little tape machines we used to use. And I do the tape and I send it. What I didn't have any sense of was that she gets the tape, she puts it on, she hears me talking, and in the background she hears boom, boom, boom. While I'm assuring her, I'm really fine. I was so used to the background noise that it never even occurred to me to think about it. It was just normal. Needless to say, that kind of freaked her out a little bit as we went on, but it's also an indication of what happens. All right, what are some of the things that really affected me over there? And what are some of the kinds of lessons that one learns in terms of what takes place? Just to give you an idea of the work, Brad suggested when we were first doing this to put a few of these together, and I'm going to slightly switch this. That's kind of what the world looked like to me when I was looking down. These are the real ones, the ones I used. We were on what's called a light table at the time. This is on the table, so I'm like this, looking at it as you take the film and put it across. Or the imagery, it might be anything side-looking radar, it could be any number of things. See how clear it is? As you're looking for any number of things, which could be missiles, it could be a number of things.
What was in that?
These are surface-to-air missile sites. And that's a surface-to-air missile taking off. And that's us blowing the hell out of my phone. Let me go back. I wanted to show you this. See how clear that is? One, it's satellite imagery, which was a little better. And two, this is the kind of PR that went out about all the kinds of things we could work with. This is what the discussion about what we as intelligence officers were doing. The other stuff is the level of clarity that we actually worked with. So doing this kind of work was tough, having to work it out, having to figure out what it was that we knew before we were doing it. Shortly after I was there, and as I mentioned, the Ia Drang Valley massacre occurred, I noticed a couple of other things. Because I had access to very sensitive material and reports as I was working through things, I was very aware of a number of times where I saw the same thing coming in reports day after day or every few days. And that was, we would have an Army group go out, and we would have a particular kind, I don't want to call it a massacre, but a number of casualties that were picked off pretty much in the same way. I try to say to people, this, for those of you in here, probably you may remember back in high school you studied how under George Washington, when we had the so-called French and Indian War, we kind of engaged in guerrilla activities, and it wasn't, you know, the British were marching forward in their Red Lobster uniforms, but the Americans were doing insurgency, so to speak. And what was happening was the VC had had the intelligence to understand where we were going, and were coming in from behind and picking off American soldiers. I had read a book written by an Australian journalist named Wilfred Burchett before I went. It was one because I was trying to learn about Vietnam before I went there. And it was one of the few books around. And Wilfred Burchett had interviewed Viet Cong. And he had written in his book about how they strategized, how they conducted these things and what they were doing and what their purpose was. And I read about it. And so I got in touch with some folks in Army intelligence, and I said, do you know about this? And to my amazement, the answer was no. And then I started sharing some of this because I thought, you know, I wasn't supposed to just care about Air Force people. I was supposed to care about all American troops. And so I worked with this for a period of time. What I can tell you is that there was an Army officer who is responsible for Army intelligence, who after the first couple of times I worked with this NCO, told his NCO he was not to collaborate with me anymore. And the reason for it, any guesses? Come on, one of you knows why. He didn't want to look bad. And he would look bad if this, what the hell does this Air Force officer know about what's going on? You know, we're the Army, we'll deal with it. That was one of the first little things that I saw in Vietnam, and I'm going, who are we fighting? You know, what is this all about? I'm going to jump ahead in time and tell you another one. I don't know how much y'all know of the sort of macro picture of the Vietnam War, but one of the most important things that was happening in the Vietnam War was a conflict among the United States Air Force, the United States Army, and the United States Navy. Is that a shock to anybody? The Navy and the Army were lobbying big time through the Pentagon and in the Pentagon to increase their air wings. Both wanted a lot more air power and the ability to do it. The Air Force was very concerned that as the Navy and the Army were growing their air wings, the Air Force was going to shrink and disappear. Because remember, the Air Force didn't exist until after the Second World War. It was the Army Air Force. How do I know this? Well, aside from having seen traffic where it was explicitly discussed, one night, in the middle of the night, literally, I get pulled aside by some people who had the clearances to do it and said, come with me. This is at Tan Son Nhut Air Base. I get in a Jeep. We ride out to a far end of Tan Son Nhut Airport and the Strip. And a couple of minutes later, in comes an RF-4, reconnaissance fighter aircraft. And there was another group of people whose job it was to take the film that had come out of that, develop it. And then I was put in a trailer, and my job was to look at these images. I was not to tell anybody about it under any circumstances. My commanding officer knew I had been pulled, but he had no idea. He was not informed. I was not allowed to talk to him or anybody else or share it with anybody. What was I looking for? I was looking for proof that the Navy was not doing its job of bombing properly because they really didn't know how to operate as well in the air as the Air Force. And the Air Force wanted this, they wanted the interpretation from me to show that that was the case. Well, it's a little bit about demonstrating the unicorn or something. I mean, you really can't show that. There isn't any way to see that. But let me tell you what happened. This Air Force reconnaissance plane and its pilot flew in the air over space that was designated for the Navy. We have something in the air, you may be familiar with, called IFF, Identify Friend or Foe. It's built into the systems. There used to be times, you know, when people, like in World War I or early World War II, would look at each other or see things. But this was all electronic by then. If there was an aircraft in the air nearby and it didn't get a positive reference to IFF, what that meant was you shoot at it. So this Air Force pilot, in some sense, was at risk while going through this area trying to find out. And if you stop for a minute and think, what is it that you could see as imagery that would show you that the Navy wasn't doing its job? And the answer is nothing. There's no way to be able to do it. I'm going to come back to this point because this has to do with intelligence. And one of the things I did shortly after I got back, I wrote an article based on my intelligence experience, which was dealing with it. And I don't know if you can see this, but the title of the article is "The Stupidity of Intelligence." And I'm going to explain more about it. I initially wrote it actually under a pseudonym. It did not give away any intelligence information, but it was very, very sensitive. So we have this mission that's concocted to demonstrate that the Air Force needs to do the job because the Navy can't. Nobody comes to me and says, this is what we're looking for, can you find this? It's just find evidence that the Navy isn't doing its job. So what else is going on here? Well, another thing I began to notice, I had access at night. Well, let me put it this way. 7th Air Force, which was the headquarters, the Air Force headquarters in Vietnam, was equivalently where that door is. This was a walkway outside, and the 363rd Reconnaissance Technical Squadron, which is where I was about here. That was the distance. And I regularly was back and forth between the two because I was responsible for the imagery interpretation and what was going on. And that meant I also was the person responsible for a lot of the briefings for the general, the colonels, etc. And I could see, I knew what was happening here and what was being said. Well, one of the things that you want to know if you're back in Washington is how effective are our airstrikes. I'm shifting gears now on you. How effective are our airstrikes? What are we really getting? Well, it turns out that you've got two kinds of reports that come. So imagine this. There's a strike on a target. Let's say there is a convoy of 7 trucks that are moving supplies for the North Vietnamese. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but the typical strike has 4 aircraft. And they go in one after the other after the other. Now, when it's over, each pilot is debriefed. You can imagine you're worried about anti-aircraft fire, you're worried about surface-to-air missiles being fired at you. You are not coming in and like a helicopter kind of hanging over the area to see what goes on. You're flying in, dropping the bombs, and getting the hell out. So you come in, and each one talks about what it is that they're doing to the intelligence officer, the debrief. Let's say for a moment, you look down, you see your bomb goes off, you see this explosion, and you see stuff up in the air, and it looks like maybe 2 of those trucks were destroyed, maybe another one damaged. And then you talk to the second pilot, and the second pilot, of course, sees things from a slightly different distance, and the third and the fourth, as you go, each of the 4 who've dropped their bombs. Now, about an hour to 20 hours later, depending on the circumstances, we have aerial reconnaissance that goes over the area, and we get the pictures of what really happened. And my folks look at it, and we report 7-truck convoy, 1 damaged. We see craters, we see the tracks through the craters, which means they're able to move on, etc. What if you were to take these other reports and you add pilot 1 to pilot 2 to pilot 3 to pilot 4? Guess what? You have more destroyed trucks than you have in the convoy. And I used to wonder about this in particular. For those of you who are old enough, you may remember this. There was something called the Thanwa Bridge.
Do you remember Dempson? Did you watch Hacksaw Ridge?
Did I watch what?
Hacksaw Ridge.
No.
No? You should watch it. It's a very nice movie. It's about a Christian military marine
Okay,
who
thank
went
you.
to fight up in Pearl Harbor in World War II.
Yeah, well, this is why I call it the stupidity of intelligence, because this is not a new issue in a certain kind of sense. And the point that I'm making is that you have all this go on. The Thanwa Bridge was a connection into North Vietnam, and it was bombed regularly, and very often what they would do is talk about the number of spans of the bridge that had been knocked out. And I used to often wonder, while I was over there, what do Americans think when they read, either this is the greatest number of spans of any bridge in the world, or the North Vietnamese are the most incredible engineers in the world because they rebuild it so quickly that they're able to do it, because it would be reported that, 3 spans are down, or 4 spans are down, or 2 spans are down every week. And it's because what they were looking at was the compilation and addition of what was being presented. Our own Strom Thurmond, good example of this, reported at one point, and this was just around the time that I came back, that he was one of many who argued why we needed to bomb North Vietnam. The logic was that at the beginning of the war, there was a truck inventory, if I remember correctly, somewhere in the neighborhood of 9,000. And after a year, there was still a truck inventory about 9,000. But if you added up all the reports that had been made about the number of trucks that had been destroyed, it also came out close to that in terms of thousands. Ergo, it had to come from somewhere. But we looked all the time in North Vietnam. It wasn't the Chinese bringing it apart. There was no way for a ship to come into Haiphong Harbor, drop off thousands of trucks, and get out without being detected. I mean, that's just not possible. But based on the fact that this was the inventory at the beginning, this is the inventory now, and supposedly this many have been destroyed, they must have some way of bringing all this in, and we've got to get in and bomb North Vietnam. Whether or not it was strategically, politically, and militarily a good idea to do it is not the point here. This was being pressed based upon a completely false notion of what the intelligence really was and what the intelligence of the people who were using it really were. And the reason I called my article The Stupidity of Intelligence was not about those of us who were doing the work, or the work that you did, and by the way, in my academic career, I've continued to see this same kind of phenomenon. The intelligence agents often are putting stuff out there. My reaction when October 7th happened in Israel, and at first all the people were saying the intelligence people failed because there wasn't warning, and now we know that there were a whole bunch of people who did the warning. I can tell you my initial reaction, and my wife can back this up, I told people immediately, I'd be willing to bet anything. This is not a failure of people who are gathering intelligence to have gathered it. This is a failure of the community to understand how to use it and what we do. So I learned this lesson pretty quickly. I also learned that a lot of people were less, in some ways, engaged, believe it or not, in the war than in other things. So I happened to have access and see a cable that went from McNamara to Westmoreland, and from Westmoreland back, that was talking about casualties. And the answer that was given was false. We have a lot of data on that now, but wasn't known at the time. And that too is intelligence information. So I learned a lot of things there. This wasn't a comfortable lesson, but it was a lesson about how we use data, what we could do with data, you know, how people really take it and explain it. And what does this mean for this young intelligence officer? How do I respond to this? How do other people respond to this? And I did it, frankly, by trying to be as honest and clear as I could about what was going on. And I'm sharing with you what I would call the anomalies of the experience, because I think they're useful. So let me share one other one. Well, two actually, 2 or 3. I had the opportunity, and I mentioned about the Navy, to see a missile site, one of the things that you saw in that photo, and I identified, along with some other people, a potential missile site. And then I was informed about one I hadn't seen, and asked to take a look at it. And I looked at it, and the generals had decided that what they wanted to do was they wanted to bomb it. And I was asked to look at it before the determination was made. And I took a look at it, and from my perspective, something seemed off. It wasn't right. I could tell. It just wasn't what a real one looked like to me. So I requested that they hold off for a day and do another reconnaissance flight over it. And when we did another reconnaissance flight over it, what we found was it was a fake site, and not very far away was a real one that was hidden better. And it was a beautiful trap to get these 4 aircraft to come in, because we did everything in 4 aircraft, and then shoot them down. And I was very proud of that, because that is what intelligence can do and how you can deal with it. But again, a lot of this has to do with whether or not people have confidence in you. Now, it may not surprise you that that changed my career there, because when I did that, in some sense, ridiculous, that I became a miracle person of a sort, because, you know, I had figured this out. It saved pilots' lives and did these other things. So clearly I knew how to do all this, and that was nice, but it didn't save everything. So let me share another story in this same vein. We had had a few days where not much in the way had changed of targets. And those of you who are in the military, you're very familiar with the notion of your wish is my command. Your commanding officer doesn't have to say you will do this. Your commanding officer might just say something like, I wonder, as in this case, the Air Force General, seems like we've had the same targets. Don't we have anything new? And I happened to be in the briefing, 6 o'clock in the morning. Later that afternoon, I receive orders to come up with a slew of targets because the general wants to see new targets. Now, what happened is it went from, not me, because I was there for technical reasons, but there was a person who regularly attended. This person then talked to the commanding officer of the squadron, who then talked to the deputy commander, who then talked to the major, who then talked to the captain, who then came and it got to me. By the time it got back to me, there was a mandate for a certain number of targets. I knew exactly what that was because I was in the briefing. And that's not what was asked for, but that's the way they wanted to do things. Many days there, I would work 18, 20, 22 hours a day. That was just what you did. And so in the middle of the night, I would sometimes go to the officers' mess and club and get something to eat. So I left for about an hour and a half and went, and I came back and I found I hate to say crusty because he was this wonderful tech sergeant of mine who was my chief NCO, who was very good at all this, is a terrific image interpreter, very loyal, very committed, and he was in tears. I'd never seen anything like that. So I asked him what happened. Well, there was a captain who was working on building his career by the name of John Irwin. I'll never forget him. And he had come in and he was very hell-bent on building his career and he didn't care what got in the way. And so he came in while I happened to be at getting some food. And he asked the tech sergeant, how many targets did you identify? And the tech sergeant said, there weren't any. And he said, what do you mean there weren't any? He said, well, we looked at the imagery and there were no targets. And he said, I want, put the film on the table. So I put it on the table and they scrolled through and they hit an area where there were a cluster of places and some movement and stuff. And he said, what about that? And he said, that's a village. And he said, you mean suspect military supply area, don't you? And then he went to another one. You mean suspect military storage area, don't you? And for those of you who are in, you know, that's a sort of plausibly deniable way to kind of say, this is what you're going to do. When I got back, as I said, my guy was in tears and explained to me what went on. And I mention this because this was a real growth moment for me. And I can remember going through, okay, what am I supposed to do here? When you raise your hand and take the oath, and especially when you're commissioned as an intelligence officer, you are given two directives that are somewhat contradictory. You will obey any order of your commanding officer. That's your job in the military. But as an intelligence officer, you are responsible for the integrity of the truth. And we were told you have to make those choices if that ever comes to that. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, these are villages. I've seen these things. I knew what was there. That's why we didn't have any targets. So I called my staff together, and in front of them, I turned to him and I said, I want you all to hear me clearly. As your commanding officer, First Lieutenant Moss Blachman, I am ordering you not to submit a target. I am telling you that this is a direct order from me, and if there's any repercussion to that order, I will take full responsibility for it. The good news is we didn't submit it, at least for that time. I can't speak of any other. Several villages continued to exist because we would have blown them up. And John Irwin never had the courage to come and say anything to me. It just disappeared. But these kinds of things happened. These were some of the kind of lessons about things. And I could spend the next 2, 3, 5 hours telling many more stories like this of things. But I want to tell you a feel-good story. So I started off by saying that I had decided I wanted to go back to school. And the Air Force had extended me beyond my commitment, as I mentioned. And you had to serve 1 year in the theater. So that meant I wouldn't get back until October. And that would be too late to start a semester. And I was worried, what am I going to do with a 2.5-year-old child, wife, no extra money, etc. And at that point, we didn't even have a GI Bill. And I thought, Lord, how am I going to make any of this? So I appealed to the Air Force. I asked them, would you allow me to get out just a month early? That's all it needed. And I can remember I got a call from the Inspector General, and the Inspector General talked to me about this. And he said, I'm sorry, but we cannot possibly allow you to do this because you have all these specialties and special clearances and stuff. And so we can't possibly let you go. And although I was still somewhat young, but now, after a year in Vietnam, you see the world a little differently. And I said, well, tell me something, sir. How is it that I'm so essential you can't let me go a month early, but after the 1st of October, I can go? How is that possible? What are you going to do in that interim month that's going to make it all okay? Why can't you just do this? To which the answer was, shut up and listen to your orders, Lieutenant. That was the end of it. Well, all of a sudden, at the end of August in '66, I get informed that my name is on a list to go back on the 6th of September. And I'm going, how in the hell did this happen? Because I had gotten letters, everything. I'd been turned down on everything. I had been endorsed by the 2-star general, the 1-star general, full colonels. None of it mattered. But I got this. And in fact, I left Vietnam and got home just in time to start the new semester here. I came here and finished a master's degree I was working on before I went to do my PhD at NYU. I thought, this is really bizarre. So how did this happen? Well, sometimes people have a lot of power you don't think about. And in this particular case, in units like this, it was the staff sergeant or airman first who was in personnel who actually made the decisions about whose name went on what. I mean, they literally filled it out. He had seen all the paperwork. I had a very good relationship with the enlisted personnel. And he had seen all the paperwork. He thought it was very unfair. So he simply put my name on the return. Now, I didn't know this at the time, so I never got to thank him in person. But I mention that because it seemed to be some kind of karma that came out of this. But also another lesson that I learned: never, ever treat people differently because of their station in life. I didn't go over there looking to treat him this way because I knew this is what I would get. I had no idea about it. But I learned we all have very important roles and things to play and things to do in life. And never, never denigrate somebody whose position is different. And you learn to do these things yourself. I also learned other lessons during this period. For example, I learned never, ever ask the question, can I do this? 99% of the time, the answer is no before you finish anything out of your mouth. The question you always ask is, how can I do this? Number two, I learned, always read the regulations yourself. because the interpretation is different. This served me extremely well in my career at the university and the hospital system and in Washington and other things. And the third was, which today is a little kind of lost, but in those days it was always make a copy of anything important. Because records and things have a way of being lost. So there are a host of other kinds of things that I would love to be able to share. It's just not enough time to do it. The strange thing was, it was an extraordinarily good and growthful experience for me. I was given the opportunity to do things as a very young man that I would never have been able to do here in the States in civilian life. And then later, I was in a position when I finished my master's here and went to NYU to work with 3 or 4 other people who had had somewhat similar experience to me in Vietnam that we met at NYU. And we ended up working with young enlisted men who are now coming to college who had been in Vietnam. And their PTSD was like 50 times what ours was. I'm very lucky. I had very little of that. I don't think anybody goes into a war zone and doesn't have some. But and these experiences have helped me cast my life. I think, I didn't mention this, but I have had over a 40-year career as a management consultant. And I would say I would attribute 75 to 80% of the success of that career to what I learned in the military. So when I sit and I look at it, I go, wow. No, it wasn't romantic. And yes, I lost that romantic sense of it. And war is hell. But the opportunity to learn, to grow, is phenomenal. And I come back to that notion of my little plea. We ought to have national service for everybody, because we all need to have these kinds of experiences that help us understand how we work together. We are so strewn apart in this country and so interested in fighting what's wrong with the other. And from my point of view, with all of its problems and everything else, I learned how critical it is to understand, appreciate, and work with other people to be successful. And I honestly believe that was critical to the success as a management consultant. And so I thank you all for kind of paying attention, and I'm glad to have shared what I did. There are a bunch of other stories, but some other time.
Thank you, Moss. Are there any questions?